The first sound was not the wind, but 3 soft knocks against my cabin door. Out here before dawn, that was a strange thing to hear. I stepped close enough to unlatch the hook and let in the bite of the mountain air. A woman stood there barefoot in the snow, her hair heavy with frost, the deer hide on her shoulders torn and hanging open to the cold. Her lips were pale, her breath short, but she didn't move toward me. She just said, "Please, I'm freezing. May I come in and wait it?" Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're listening from in the comments and tap like and subscribe if you've ever had to make a choice in a moment that could change everything. My name's Calder Ridge, and for the last 5 winters, I've lived alone at the far end of a ridge trail, where the bitter range begins its climb. 30 acres of hard ground and timber enough to keep me fed if I work it right. Before that, I wore the blue coat in the war, came home with a limp in my right leg and a taste for quiet that never quite left. The fever took my wife and little girl in the same week, and after I laid them in the ground, I quit the town for good. Out here, my company's the sound of an axe splitting wood, the creak of the rafters in a storm, and the cry of a hawk hunting over the pass. I was raised on land farther south, where my father measured wealth by what you could do with your own hands, not by what you owned. We rose before sunup, worked until the sky went black, and kept a Bible on the table beside the salt and coffee. Mother taught me the worth of neighborly duty, that if someone's stock got loose or their roof took wind damage, you saddled up and lent a hand. In town, money was starting to speak louder than those old rules. The railroad men were pushing north land agents, talking fast in back rooms. And folks who once traded in good faith now measured friendship by the ledger. Life up here is lean, but steady. In summer, I keep a garden and put up what I can. In winter, I run trap lines, smoke meat, and stretch my coffee as far as it will go. I've no one to feed but myself, and that's been the way of it for years. The cold marks time better than any brass clock, and I know the sound of my own boots on the floorboards, better than I know the sound of another person's voice. That morning, though, the knock came, and with it a reminder that the world has ways of finding you, no matter how far you've gone. I didn't yet know who she was or what kind of trouble she'd walked through to get here. All I knew was that there was a young woman at my door in a storm. And the choice I made in that moment would turn this quiet life of mine onto a trail I hadn't planned to ride. The cold hung in the air like a weight seeping through the chinks in the logs, even after I'd fed the stove. Tala stayed close to the fire, her knees drawn up under the wool blanket I'd given her the night before. Her dark hair fell over her shoulders in damp strands, and the set of her jaw hadn't softened since I'd opened the door to her. She hadn't said much since, and I hadn't pressed her. I set the kettle near the flame and reached for a small crate in the corner. Inside were hard biscuits, a tin of salted venison, and a pouch of dried beans. It wasn't much, but it was food that would keep. I warmed the meat and set it in front of her. She took it without hesitation, eating slowly, her fingers steady, despite the tremor still in her shoulders. "You speak English?" I asked, once she'd finished. She gave a single nod. "Enough." Her voice was low, a little rough from the cold. "Name?" After a pause, she said, "Tala." I didn't repeat it. I just gave a short nod and leaned back in my chair, watching the fire catch a fresh log. Her bare foot stuck out from under the blanket, red and swollen at the arch. The skin cracked along the heel. "You hurt anywhere else?" I asked. "No. Just cold." Her eyes stayed on the flames, but when she spoke again, her words came with the weight of someone who'd been holding them too long. "I was with traders. They took me north and sold me. I ran. They followed. I don't know where I am now. You're in the Bitter Range. Closest town's 30 miles west. No one comes out here unless they know where to look." Some of the tension left her shoulders at that. She set the tin aside and sat back, pulling the blanket tighter around herself. From the shelf above my cot, I pulled an old flannel shirt, wool socks, and a pair of worn long johns. I set them on the edge of the blanket. They'll fit well enough for now. I'll turn my back. She hesitated, then nodded. I stood by the door facing the wall and listened to the quiet rustle of fabric. When she said she was done, I turned. The sleeves hung past her wrists and the shirt swallowed her frame. But she looked warmer, less like she might collapse where she sat. "You'll stay tonight," I said. She agreed with a small nod. I unrolled my bedroll beside the hearth, leaving the cot for her. She watched me for a moment, her eyes holding something I couldn't quite read, before lying down and turning toward the wall. The room settled into the kind of silence that wasn't uncomfortable, just new. By morning, frost laced the window panes and my leg ached from the cold. I got the fire going again before stepping outside to check the sky. The snow had drifted in the night, smoothing out every track and marking the land as untouched. The air bit at my face as I crossed to the woodpile, the only sound the crunch of snow under my boots. When I came back in, Tala was awake, sitting up on the cot with the blanket around her. She watched the door close behind me, but didn't speak. I cooked salt pork with boiled potatoes, setting a plate on the table for her. She limped slightly as she crossed the room to sit. "When did they take you?" I asked between bites. "South of Tombstone, near the river crossing. I was heading east." "You were with your people before that?" She shook her head. "No tribe. Not anymore." She didn't explain, and I didn't push. When we finished, I stood and pulled on my coat. "Got traps to check. You stay inside. Don't open for anyone. If someone does come, wait for me." Her brow tightened like she wanted to argue, but she stayed seated. I set a loaded rifle by the door. "You know how to use one?" "Yes. Only if you need to." The walk to the nearest trap line was quiet, the wind low enough that it felt like the world was holding its breath. 2 hares, both frozen stiff, were the morning's catch. I reset the traps and turned back, my thoughts circling around the woman now sitting in my cabin. She hadn't begged for anything, not after she'd come inside. She'd kept to herself, but she hadn't tried to leave either. When I stepped through the door, the cabin was tidier than I'd left it. My tools were stacked neatly, the mugs washed and dried by the stove. Tala stood by the fire, her hair combed and braided, the blanket folded on the cot. She stepped back when I entered, watching for my reaction. "We'll skin these together," I said, setting the hairs on the table. "After, I'll boil water for your foot." "Thank you." It was the first time she'd said it, and though I only nodded, something in the room shifted. We worked in steady quiet. She handled the knife like she'd done it before, her cuts clean and sure. "My grandfather taught me," she said when I asked. I didn't ask about the rest. Not yet. Later, I brought out a tin of salve bandages and boiled linen. Her foot was raw, but not frostbitten. She kept her eyes on the fire as I cleaned it, her mouth tightening only when the salve stung. "You'll need better clothes," I said, "and boots." She looked at me cautious. "You want me to look better?" "No. I want you warm, covered, and safe." She held my gaze for a long moment before nodding. By the time the sun dropped low over the ridge, the meat was salted. For drying, the tools were back in place, and the cabin smelled faintly of stew. Tala sat by the fire with her blanket wrapped around her shoulders, the hem of the flannel shirt brushing her bare feet. I sharpened my axe, the sound of steel on stone steady in the warm light. "Do you live here year-round?" she asked. "I do." "Why alone?" I kept my eyes on the blade. "Lost my family. Long time back. I'm sorry." I poured the last of the coffee into a tin mug and handed it to her. She took it without a word, sipping slowly. That night, she watched me as I settled onto the bedroll. The firelight reached across the space between us, touching the edge of the cot where she sat. After a while, she lay down, turning toward the wall again. The quiet that followed wasn't the same as before. It carried something else now, something that hadn't been there when she'd first stepped in from the cold. By the third morning, the wind had dropped, leaving the land white and still under a pale sky. The fire had burned low in the night, and the cold had crept back into the cabin's corners. I eased myself up from the bedroll, working the stiffness from my leg, then added 2 dry splits to the stove. The crackle and pop filled the room again. Tala was awake, sitting on the edge of the cot, with her foot wrapped in the linen I'd tied days before. Her hair hung loose, combed through the braids she'd worn undone. She folded the blanket she'd used, setting it neatly at the cot's foot, then crossed to the table without being asked. I put a plate of leftover pork and beans in front of her. She ate slow, taking small bites, glancing now and then toward the frosted window. "I can work," she said after a while. "Your foot's not ready for walking the ridge," I told her. "I can do wood or clean." I studied the way she set her weight. The limp was still there, but less than before. "All right," I said. "We'll split wood together." She pulled my second coat from the hook and wrapped it tight over the flannel shirt. Outside, the snow squeaked under our boots. I showed her the grain in the logs, how to set each piece square on the block. Her first swing struck at an angle, the blade lodging halfway. She worked it free without looking my way and tried again. By the third, the split was clean. We worked in a steady rhythm through the morning, she cutting me, stacking. Her hands reddened from the cold, but she didn't slow. When the pile was twice what it had been, we went back inside. She set the axe by the door and brushed the sawdust from her sleeves. Over a noon meal of stew and hard bread, I asked, "When's the last time someone helped you?" She kept her eyes on the bowl. "Before my mother died. I was 17, and now I don't want pity," she said. "I'm not offering pity. Just a place to be warm, a bedwork if you wanted food while I've got it." She set her spoon down, and then I looked at the fire a moment. "We figure it out." That night she sat by the hearth longer than before, her foot soaking in a basin of warm water. I read an old trail journal by lamplight, the pages yellowed and soft at the edges. She rose finally, dragging her blanket to the cot. Before lying down, she turned toward me. "Why'd you open the door?" "You knocked," I said. "Didn't lie, didn't beg after. You were freezing." Her gaze held mine a moment before she nodded. "All right." The next day began with a gray light filtering through the frost-coated glass. I checked the traps at first light, returning with nothing but one broken spring. Tala had swept the floor and was pulling the patched deer-hide dress from the peg. She sat by the fire, needle in hand, working the seams. The beads along the hem caught the lamplight as she stitched. I poured coffee into 2 tin mugs and set one by her knee. She accepted it with a quiet nod, not breaking her rhythm. Outside, the snow had crusted hard, but the wind was gone, and the ridge trail lay open in both directions. By afternoon, the sun pushed through the haze, casting long bands of gold across the floorboards. She spoke without looking up from her stitching. "You said you lost your wife and child." I set the mug down. "Fever, bad winter, couldn't get help in time. My little girl was 3. She nodded slowly. "I lost my brother. They said he stole a horse. He didn't. They hung him anyway. After that, I left. Tribe didn't say anything. The room went still except for the fire's crackle." She worked another seam, her jaw tight. That night, she stood at the hearth after supper, stirring the pot one last time. Her patched dress tied at the waist with a strip of cloth shifted slightly as she turned toward me. Her eyes held steady on mine. "You haven't touched me, not once. You needed safety," I said. "And if I want more than safety now," I rose slowly, my movements careful. She stepped closer, her hand brushing along my jaw. "I stayed, didn't I?" I looked at her a long moment before leaning down. The kiss was slow, warm, her hands resting against my chest. When we lay down under the same blanket later, her head against my shoulder, neither of us spoke. Outside, the cold settled deeper over the ridge. But inside, for the first time in years, I wasn't alone. The morning after we first shared the cot, the air in the cabin felt different. The fire still burned steady, but the silence had changed. Tala rose before I did, her hair tied back with a thin strip of leather. The sleeves of my flannel rolled above her wrists. She moved about the room with the quiet of someone who knew where things belonged. We ate breakfast without hurry. Outside, the snow was beginning to sink in patches under a weak sun. I pointed out the eastern fence line through the frost-marked glass. A section had buckled under the weight of drifted snow. She set her tin mug down. "I can help fix it," she said. We hauled 2 posts on the sled, the hammer and nails wrapped in burlap. The ground was soft enough to take a post if we worked it right. She held each one steady while I drove it deep, the ring of iron on wood carrying over the empty ridge. Her hands didn't shake. By midday, we'd set 3 posts and cleared the shed wall where snow had piled heavy. Back inside, she pulled the pot from the hook over the fire, adding dried potatoes and the last of the wild onion. The smell filled the cabin. When she set the bowls down, she served mine first. It was a small thing, but it stayed with me. After we ate, she stood near the fire, brushing at the sleeve of the patched deer-hide dress she'd been mending. "I want to go to town," she said. "For what, Boots? Cloth, maybe more food?" "I want to trade something. I told her we'd go together, but folks might stare. They may think I paid for you, brought you here like a stray." Her eyes didn't flinch. "Let them think what they want." I studied her face for a long moment. "If we go, they'll ask who you are to me." She stepped closer, her voice low. "And what will you say?" "That you're with me," I said. "Or I can say wife if you want it." Her gaze held mine, careful but steady. "Not yet. But don't say I'm nothing. I wouldn't." That night, the wind came down from the ridge again. She curled into me under the blanket, her fingers resting against my ribs. Just before the lamp burned out, she spoke into the quiet. "I'm not going anywhere." The next day, we packed for the trip. 2 cured hares, a bundle of pelts, the last good coffee wrapped in cloth. Tala had washed and stitched the deer-hide dress again, the beads cleaned, but the tears across the side still showed. She looked at it, frowning slightly. "It's all I have," she said. "That shirt's mine," I told her. "Keep it. I'll bring my coat for you." The coat hung loose on her, buttoned to her throat. The mare pulled the sled without complaint as we started down the ridge. Tala rode beside me, her hair tucked beneath my spare hat, her eyes following the lay of the land. By the time we reached Brunette's Crossing, dusk was settling in. The street was a strip of wooden fronts, chimneys sending up smoke. Inside the general store, 2 men leaned at the counter, their eyes on her the moment we stepped through. The storekeeper, a thin older man with white whiskers, looked from me to Tala. "You've not brought company before," he said. "She's with me," I told him. That was enough for him to fetch what we needed: boots, thread, and grain. The men at the counter muttered something low, but when I turned my head, they looked away. We left with the goods tied in burlap. Tala climbed onto the sled, her hand brushing mine briefly as I adjusted the reins. The wind cut sharp on the way back, blowing loose snow into our faces. She leaned closer to me, the coat wrapped tight around her. My hand rested on her knee under the coat to steady her as the sled jolted over the hard path. By the time we reached the cabin, the sky was black and the fire inside had gone low. I set the burlap down, and she pulled on the boots right there, flexing her toes in the stiff leather. A faint smile crossed her face. "You stood for me today," she said. "Didn't have to think about it," I answered. She stepped toward me, the coat half open, firelight on her face. You said I'm with you. Do you mean that I mean it? Her lips touched mine, soft and certain. We didn't speak much after that. The storm came back in the night, but inside the quiet felt like home. The morning after our trip to town, the sky stretched clear and pale over the ridge. The cold still pressed against the windows, but the air inside felt warmer than it had in weeks. Tala stood barefoot on the planked floor, smoothing the hem of a deep brown wool dress she'd traded for. It was plain hand-stitched and fit her in a way that looked made for her. It's not Apache, she said, fastening the last button at the neckline, but it's mine. I leaned against the doorframe, arms folded. You look like you belong here. Her eyes met mine. I do. Outside, the drifts had shrunk into patchy ridges, and the ground was softening in the midday sun. I'd pulled the mare from the lean-to, brushed her down, and checked the saddle for spring work. Tala ladled out the morning stew, setting my bowl on the table before sitting across from me. Between bites, she said, I want to start a garden. You've got land enough? I looked toward the strip of ground near the cabin wall where the snow had melted first. We'd need to break it deep, fence it off. I can do that, she said. You showed me how. We'll need seed, I told her. I can ride west in 2 weeks. Trade the last of the pelts. I'll come with you. I studied her for a moment. Town's not always easy, not for you. She didn't look away. I won't hide again. We spent the afternoon working in the thawing sunlight. I set to mending the gate hinge while she marked lines in the soil with the toe of her boot. The sleeves of her dress were rolled above her elbows, her hands working the dirt without hesitation. By midday, we'd cleared a 10-foot stretch and stacked the old posts we'd cut in winter. I drove one deep with the back of the axe, while she leaned on the next, catching her breath. You thinking about planting corn? I asked. Beans? Maybe squash. My mother said, if they grow together, they protect each other. I nodded. That's true. She was quiet for a moment, then turned toward me. You thinking about marriage? Her question caught me still, though I'd thought about it for weeks. I've been thinking about it since you first slept in my bed, I said. You waited long enough to say it. I want it to be real, I told her. Not about what we came through, but about what we stay for. She looked from the snow behind me to the fence we'd set, then back to my face. It's real. I reached into my coat pocket and brought out a ring of plain iron shaped by my own hand. Made it last week. Wasn't sure if I should ask. You just did, she said. I held it out. Stay as my wife. Stay here. Not as someone I saved, but as someone I need. Her fingers trembled as she took it, but only briefly. She slid it onto her own hand. I'm not leaving. That evening, the fire burned high, throwing a warm glow across the room. Tala combed her hair near the hearth, while I closed the shutters against the cooling air. We ate quietly, the kind of quiet that comes from knowing the work is done for the day. As I passed her chair, she reached up and kissed me behind the ear, her hand resting at my lower back. When we turned in for the night, she curled into me as though she'd always done it, her breath warm against my throat, my arm around her waist. The cabin didn't feel like a place to disappear anymore. It felt like the start of something meant to last. The days that followed settled into a rhythm neither of us had planned. The snow continued to pull back from the ridge, leaving the ground dark and wet in its wake. Each morning, Tala tied her hair back and stepped outside with me to work. We cleared brush from the garden plot, drove posts along the edges, and stacked rails in neat lines for the fence to come. Her boots sank deep into the soft earth, but she kept at it without slowing. In the afternoons, I turned to repairs, mending the shed roof, where winter had split the boards, checking the hinges on the lean-to, oiling the tack. Tala kept the fire hot boiled water for coffee and spread the seed list on the table, marking the things she wanted planted. She'd point to each item, her voice steady, explaining how her mother had grown them together in the same patch so they'd shield one another from wind and sun. One morning, while I was setting a post near the east edge, she came across the yard carrying a strip of leather and a small tin. "Your saddle's cracked near the cantle," she said, kneeling beside it. She worked the oil into the leather with the care of someone who'd done it many times before. I watched her hands, sure and deliberate, then went back to my work without a word. When the fence rails were finally in place, she stepped back and shaded her eyes. "It'll hold," she said. "It will," I agreed. That evening, the wind picked up out of the north, rattling the shutters. I checked the latch on the door before banking the fire for the night. She stood at the counter shaping dough for the next day's bread. The lamplight caught the iron ring on her finger, and I remembered the way she'd slid it on without hesitation. After supper, she joined me by the fire, pulling her chair close. "We'll need to go for seeds sooner than we thought," she said. "If we wait 2 weeks, the ground will be too dry by planting." I nodded. "We can ride to Danton's Fork in 3 days. It's closer than the Western Trail." Her brow creased slightly. "I've heard the folks there aren't friendly to strangers." "They aren't," I said. "But we won't give them reason to trouble us." We rose before dawn on the day we left. The mare was restless in the cool air, her breath puffing white as I cinched the saddle. Tala packed the pelts we'd kept back for trade and filled a small sack with bread and dried meat. By the time the sun touched the ridge, we were headed east. The trail narrowed where it crossed the gulch, and the spring thaw had made the footing slick. Tala rode behind me, her eyes taking in the lay of the land. We passed stands of cottonwood, their branches bare but swelling with buds. By mid-afternoon, the buildings of Danton's Fork came into view, low, false fronts, a weathered church steeple smoke from half a dozen chimneys. We stopped first at the trading post. The keeper, a broad man with a gray beard and deep-set eyes, looked from me to Tala as we stepped inside. His gaze lingered a second too long, but he said nothing, only asked what we were bringing. The trade was quick. Pelts for seed corn beans and squash, plus a small sack of oats for the mare. Tala kept her chin level the entire time, her hands steady as she checked the seed bags. When we stepped back into the street, the wind carried the sound of a hammer striking iron from the blacksmith shop. We made camp a mile out near a stand of pines. Tala built the fire while I hobbled the mare. We ate in silence, the smell of wood smoke curling through the still air. She stretched out on her bedroll, looking up at the dark between the branches. "It's different being here with a plan," she said quietly. The ride back was uneventful until we reached the edge of the ridge. A rider appeared from the north trail, a tall man on a bay gelding. He slowed as he came near, tipping his hat in greeting, but his eyes flicked between us with quiet calculation. "Afternoon," he said. "Afternoon," I answered. He glanced at the seed bags tied behind my saddle. "Looks like planting time?" "It is," I said, giving nothing more. He touched his brim again, then turned his gelding down the slope. We watched until he was out of sight. Tala looked at me, her brow drawn. "You know him?" "No," I said. But he knew enough to wonder. We rode the rest of the way in silence, the wind carrying the smell of thawed earth. Back at the cabin, I stowed the seed inside while she unpacked the last of our gear. The evening settled around us, the fire snapping in the stove. We didn't speak much over supper, both turning over the same thought, the rider who'd come out of nowhere on the ridge. 3 days passed after we saw the rider on the ridge. The thaw moved quicker now, the ground soft enough that our boots sank with every step. Tala and I kept to the work, fitting the last rails along the garden fence, stacking kindling near the porch, checking the creek for runoff that might flood the lower ground. The morning air still carried a bite, but the afternoons felt warmer. Inside the cabin smelled of stew most days, the fire kept low but steady. Tala had taken to keeping her seed packets lined along the shelf, measuring and remeasuring them, as though spring might hurry if she willed it. It was late one afternoon when the sound of hooves reached us again. I stepped out onto the porch. The same tall man on the bay, gelding, rode up the trail reins loose in one hand. He drew to a stop a few feet from the steps. "Name's Warren Pike," he said. "I keep the north pasture along the fork." I nodded, but didn't move from where I stood. Calder Ridge. His gaze shifted past me toward the open door, catching sight of Tala. Didn't mean to intrude. Just passing along word 2 men in Danton's Fork, asking about a woman matching her description. Tala stepped into the doorway, her face unreadable. Did they give names? Didn't hear any. One was stocky, other thin as a rail. Wore trail dust like they'd been riding hard. Pike looked back to me. "Figured you ought to know." I thanked him, and he tipped his hat before turning the gelding back toward the north trail. We watched him ride until he disappeared behind the trees. Tala closed the door quietly. "They're looking for me," she said. I set my coat on the peg. "Then we'll be ready if they come." That evening, we checked the rifle by the door and made sure the lanterns were filled. She worked beside me without being told, her hand steady as she rolled spare cartridges into a cloth pouch. For the next 2 days, nothing stirred on the trail. The sky stayed clear, the wind low, but there was a weight in the quiet. We took turns watching from the porch at first light and just before dark. On the 3rd day, near sundown, the crunch of boots sounded outside. A knock followed 3 measured raps. I opened the door to find Warren Pike again, his coat dusted from the ride. "They're in Brunette's Crossing now," he said. "Seen asking at the store and the smithy." "How far behind?" I asked. "If they ride steady, they could be here by tomorrow." I nodded once. "Thank you for the warning." Pike's eyes met mine, something like understanding passing between us. "Watch your ridge." After he left, I barred the door and turned to Tala. "We've got tonight to settle what we need to." She stepped close, her voice low but certain. "I'm not running again." We moved through the cabin, checking windows, setting a second rifle by the back door. The fire burned low, casting long shadows across the floor. When everything was in place, we sat at the table, the lamplight between us. "They won't find what they came for," I said. Tala's fingers rested on the edge of the table, the iron ring glinting in the light. "They won't take me from here." The wind picked up outside, rattling the loose board on the lean-to. We didn't speak again that night, but the stillness between us was no longer the kind that waited. It was the kind that braced. By morning, the air was still, the sky streaked pale gold. Tala stood at the window, her hair unbound, watching the trail below. I poured coffee, the smell drifting between us like a quiet signal that the day had begun. Just after sunup, 2 riders came into view. They moved slow, scanning the ridge as they climbed. I stepped onto the porch, the rifle resting easy in my arms. Tala stayed just inside her shadow, steady against the wall. When the men reached the yard, they reined in. Dust clung to their coats, their faces drawn from travel. The stockier one spoke first. "We're looking for a woman. Apache, mid-20s. Belongs to us." I let the silence stretch before answering. "No one here belongs to you." The thin man's hand twitched toward his belt, but I shifted the rifle just enough for the message to carry. "You've come far enough. Turn back and there'll be no trouble." They traded glances. The bigger one spat in the dirt. "She's worth more than you know, Ridge." "That's where you're wrong," I said. "I know exactly what she's worth, and it can't be bought." Neither moved for a long moment. Then, without a word, they pulled their horses around and started back down the trail. The sound of hooves faded until only the wind through the pines remained. Inside, Tala exhaled her shoulders, easing. We sat at the table, the coffee still warm. "They won't be back," I told her. She nodded once her eyes clear. The thaw came in full the next week. The creek ran high, the soil soft enough to turn. We planted the first rows together, beans, corn, and a small patch of herbs she favored. By summer, the ridge looked different. Fences mended the garden thick with green, the cabin warm with the smell of baking bread. The evenings were quiet, but not empty, the kind that settled deep and stayed. I'd thought I was taking someone in that winter, giving her a place to rest. Turned out, we'd built something together, something neither of us had known we were missing. Out here, justice doesn't always come from the law. Sometimes it's in standing your ground, in giving someone the right to choose where they belong. And sometimes it's in finding that you've chosen the same place. If you've ever known what it means to make a stand and call a place home, you'll understand. And if you have, I hope you'll remember to tell that story. Folks need to hear it.